Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome back to Learning to Die podcast. Today I am joined by Rachel Menzies. Now, Rachel, is it Dr. Rachel Menzies? Is it Rachel? Is it Miss Menzies, Mrs. Menzies, Professor Menzies? What's the correct title?
It's Doctor, but you can call me Rachel.
Well, it's like someone said to me years ago. They said, because they said to me, are you a doctor or is it Mr.? I said, it's Doctor. And they said, do you make people call you Doctor? I said, only assholes have to call me Doctor. So you can call me Doctor. Excellent. Rachel, thank you very much for coming on today. I really appreciate you coming on. Today, we are discussing Rachel's work called Mortals, which I will reference. However, for anybody watching on YouTube, this is the book, Mortals, How the Fear of Death Shaped Human Society. Absolutely brilliant book. My wife got it for me for Christmas, and I just mowed through it in a few weeks, and I was raving to Kieran about it as well. So really happy to have you on today to discuss this, Rachel.
Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
No problem. So, Rachel, for people who don't know you, can you give us a little bit of background on your journey to coming to write this book?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist and a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Sydney. And both my research at the university and my clinical work focuses on fears of death, specifically in the context of mental health conditions. It was something that I'd always been quite interested in, I think, even when I was younger. Just interested in death being such a taboo and something that people typically don't like to talk about. And then when I went to university, alongside my psychology degree, I also got a degree in ancient history, where, of course, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of reading ancient texts, which talk a lot about death or rituals around death and that sort of thing. And so it was around that time that I started to talk with my father, who's also a clinical psychologist who co-wrote the book. We started to talk about the relevance of fears of death to mental health in particular. And that's something we've been working on academically for close to a decade. But this is really our first attempt to convey a lot of that work to a general audience.
Excellent. And did you grow up in Sydney, Rachel, or whereabouts in Australia are you from?
I did. I'm in Sydney. So I've lived in Sydney for my whole life. Excellent.
Great. Sydney's a great place to go and live, everybody. If you want to buy a house, you're probably looking at about 4 million. So it's easy to get into now, really. It's gone through the roof with coronavirus. I thought Perth was bad, but my God, Sydney is just, you'd nearly want to live in Melbourne and commute in every day. It's absolutely crazy. And I was going to say, did you grow up anywhere around the beaches around Sydney, or are you more inland? Or
no, more inland? Yeah.
I've been over here quite a bit. I used to go up to the Blue Mountains, and every year there was a 100k race up there around the Blue Mountains. So I did that like 7 years in a row.
Oh wow!
So it's nice up there. I go up and stay around Katoomba or Laura. It's very, very nice, but it gets cold in the winter. But it's a very beautiful place. Yeah.
It's a beautiful area.
Yeah. I thought I was going to die a few times there. I can tell you that. Talking about death. When you're running for between 13 and 17 hours, a few times in the middle of the night, you think like I could die right now. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I can imagine.
Oh, excellent. So, you're saying like you're a postdoctoral researcher and a clinical psychologist. So what's the sort of, do you see patients or clients during the week, and then you spend some time researching? It's like a 50-50 split?
Yeah, I do the research Monday to Thursday, and then I see patients on days around that. So Fridays, Saturdays, after hours. So it's a nice balance. I find the research background helps my clinical practice be a lot strong, up-to-date, evidence-based. And the clinical work also helps to inform my research, because I learn a lot from patients about their experiences, which opens up new research questions and things to investigate.
I think that's such an important aspect. This week we were writing a response to a journal for a paper that we had submitted, and I came back like with major revisions. And I was just saying to our co-authors, this person is very, very academic, but has no actual experience in what we do. And so I really made the case back to the editor in a separate letter about how collectively our team, had all worked in this industry or had consulted into this industry, and we had over 60 years experience. And sort of, I think that kind of feedback from industry back into academia is so important, like to make practical solutions for the future. So it's such an important component, but not a lot of academics actually do it.
I completely agree. And I think this is why we were so interested in writing models, because I think part of the problem in psychology is that people tend to work within their own discipline, in their own silos. So social psychologists are doing their social psychology research and not reading into clinical psychology. Clinical psychologists are doing their clinical psychology research and not reading in social psychology. And so it was really decades before these two fields started to work together in the area of death specifically. And this is why we felt it was so important to get some of these ideas out, not just to clinical psychologists, which is what we've been doing, but also just to the general public, because these ideas are fascinating and there's so much evidence behind them, but there's something that until recently haven't really garnered attention beyond, the university institutions.
Yeah. We actually did a podcast a few weeks ago with an Irish doctor. He's retired now, consulting gastroenterologist. And we actually had a very similar, a part of our discussion was about this potential, what's lost when researchers aren't partaking in practice. And there's the disconnect that forms where if researchers are only in the research at how what they perceive as actually even useful research to do can be so far adrift from what's taking place, quote unquote, in the trenches, it can end up becoming it can lead to a lot of pointless research that doesn't actually contribute to the field in a way that's actually going to benefit people. In his case, it was in medicine. Like, he kind of had this analogy in this really nice book called "Can Medicine Be Cured?" He actually wrote another book called "How We Die Now," which was his first book, and he was involved in that Lancet commission on the value of death that came out a few weeks ago. And he was one of the writers because of that. And so he might actually be an interesting person for us to even put you in contact with if you were ever interested. But he kind of used this analogy of there's this kind of, there's that concept of science, kind of the wall of science is built one brick at a time. Whereas he kind of uses this analogy in the book that, well, okay, if we take that analogy, but then we look at the way that so much research is actually being done and how much of this research is being done by people who don't have any contact with real patients and real people. And as a result, the bricks that they're making are just being chucked into a field randomly that aren't actually being used to build anything, because there's no actual skin in the game. There's no contact with reality. There's no feedback loops that you get from working with real people in real circumstances of what's actually of relevance in a clinical setting. And it's the same. And it's the same thing with me and Ian. Like Ian just mentioned, like I come from my education is in sport and exercise sciences, and so much sport science is done in an academic world that's just utterly pointless and doesn't really assist practitioners at all, because it's being guided by researchers that themselves aren't coaches or aren't sports psychologists or aren't strength and conditioning practitioners or aren't physiotherapists. So as a result, they have no contact with reality to provide feedback loops on what's actually of relevance in a real setting. So it seems to be like this real meta problem across academia, that there's a disconnect between research and practice.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Cool.
We've added another warrior to our cause. It's one of the reasons, actually, Rachel, I didn't go into academia full time, because I can't do it. I came from industry. I had nearly 20 years of military and mining working in management and leadership roles before I went back to my PhD. And then after my PhD, I was like, there's no way I think if I was like 22, I could have done it. But if I was after that, I was like, there's no way I can go into academia and just be myopic in a view. So this is why I picked my path going forward. But anyway, we are here to talk about your book. So let's dig into this. Rachel, is it fair to say in this book that you present the first chapter, Awakening to Death, as like a context chapter, and then that every chapter after that, right up to chapter 13, which is the Stoicism and Neutral Acceptance, before we get to the last chapter, these are all kind of nearly like the James Reason model, if people are familiar with it. It's like the Swiss cheese model. We have death, and then we have all these like layers or elements in defense of death. And that's how I viewed every one of your chapters. They were like walls or layers that people would put up, even though they're going to die, but they were like these things that they put up in front of them, that was basically, having what I would call an immortality complex. I'm going to live forever, such as like building statues, love, having families, having kids. And it's interesting, like some of these things get people's backs up when you actually say it to them, about having kids because they want to live forever type of thing. You spoke here about funeral practices, which we've spoken recently with Johnny Dillon from Ireland about. You've spoken about religion and so on. But is it fair to say that all of these are like kind of like self-imposed or created denials that people put in place?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. We talk in the book about the different strategies really that humans have developed across thousands of years to try and cope with this fear. The fear of death is something that develops quite early in life. By the end of the first decade of life, children know that they're going to die, that people they know are going to die, and that there's nothing they can do about it. And so the argument is then that they spend the rest of their life coming up with strategies to deal with that fear, or using the strategies their culture gives them to deal with that fear. And some of those things are things like religious belief in an afterlife, which promises a literal immortality, and others are more symbolic things. So things like creating some kind of immortality project, trying to leave some kind of legacy or artwork or something that's going to live on after you die. And children, as you mentioned, being one solution for that problem. By passing on our genes to the next generation, we have some sense that part of us is going to live on. So in the book, we talk about the different strategies that people seem to use. And we also try and talk about, I suppose, alternatives to those strategies. So the idea that each of those strategies ultimately isn't probably going to be very effective, and why acceptance of death rather than denial seems to be the best way forward.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I want to actually just talk about one of these kind of, we'll say, layers or controls that people put in place was on religion. And this struck me as very pertinent when I read it, because only about 10 days beforehand, somebody had said to me about, did you know with coronavirus that there's bodies floating down the Ganges? And I went, well, I think you might find that there's bodies floating down the Ganges most of the year. And it's happening for a long time. No, it's because of coronavirus. There's so many bodies that they're just like shoveling them into the river. And I was like, oh, okay. And because I have that interest in Hinduism and Buddhism and stuff and so on. And you actually said here in the book, around 35,000 corpses are cremated each year into the river. And many of these are only partially burnt, basically because people can't afford the charcoal and the wood or whatever fuel it is to burn the body completely. So the corpses just get pushed into the water. But at the same hand too, people are in there, brushing their teeth, going to the toilet, washing saucepans, whatever it might be. And 400 million people use that river every year. And then I found that, you quote some studies here, about 300 times higher the levels of fecal material found in the water, and basically excessive bacteria levels as well. So this river is, in the Hindu culture is basically like a holy river or a spiritual place to go, and people go and bathe in the Ganges and so on. But because so many people use it for different reasons, it's basically, it could be causing more death than it could be actually helping people to live. So this is one of these fascinating things I found in like going through the book that was really, kind of paradoxical to what people think it will be.
Yeah. It's and of course, the reason people are bathing in the Ganges is because their religion has told them that it's basically a surefire ticket to escape the circle of rebirth and to gain essentially immortality, so that their soul is not continuously reincarnated, but that they experience liberation. And so people will be cremated in the river, bathe in the river. But like you've quoted there, thousands, hundreds of thousands of children die every year because of the contamination of the river. And, this isn't unique to Hinduism. We see this in many of the religions where people will do things that might even physically harm them in some way or harm other people, harm people of a different conflicting religious worldview, if it gives them a sense of immortality. If their religion tells them that doing a certain thing, believing a certain thing is a surefire ticket to an afterlife, people will do all kinds of things to gain that certainty around death.
Yeah, I'm sure that Karen and I can both empathize with this, being raised Catholic and being guilted into doing things, or particularly giving money to the church. When I'm a bit older than Karen, when I was growing up, Karen, in Ireland, the priest would read out how much each family had donated each year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they would go like, the O'Regan household, £5. The Doonican household, £26. The Kellys, 1,500. Well done, the Kellys. That's what used to go on. Yeah. So,
Shame of it.
Yeah. So that's a different way as well. But also the Catholic religion is very good in terms of you can do whatever you like, but once you go to confession, you get to start again. So it's good in some ways. You also burst my bubble here, Rachel, in this book as well, in the religion part, in the religion chapter, because based here in Perth, we're only about 5 hours from Singapore, and we like to go to Singapore quite a lot. My wife and I, we have holidays there. My wife's sister was a school teacher there. I used to travel internationally a lot, and so we'd have like 3 or 4 day breaks there. And we used to always love going to the Buddha Tooth Relic, until I read this out to my wife, and she was like, oh, my God, they're making so much money. The Buddha Tooth Relic, Karen, is this beautiful temple. Have you been there, Rachel?
No, I've been to a different temple in Sri Lanka, which also claims to have a tooth of the Buddha, but I haven't been to one in Singapore.
Yeah, it's only like a stone's throw away from actually a Hindu temple as well, but it's they're both in the back of Chinatown. The Buddha Tooth Relic Temple Museum was built in Singapore to house the Buddha's left canine tooth. By the way, you can't go and see it. It's inside a room, which is inside a glass thing. You can see it in the distance. The temple cost $56 million to construct, and the devotees donated 234 kilograms of gold. 234 kilograms of gold for its impressive stupa. It is very impressive. I might send you some pictures during the week if I can find some. In 2018, the temple reported an annual income of more than $10 million, largely from charitable donations. So you can buy like little Buddhas inside, and you can house them across in of different sizes, and have donation boxes everywhere. The temple attracts 3.6 million visitors each year, eager to glimpse what they believe to be the Buddha's sacred tooth. It's about 4 or 5 levels high. It's just a beautiful temple, though, to go and see, and the grounds were really nice. That's where we go. I actually didn't pay much attention to the tooth up on the top floor, but it's just a really beautiful temple. It's got a museum in it as well. So that was quite interesting as well, that that these environments basically, make so much money as well, and help people in this denial of death.
Yeah, that's right. And clearly religion offers benefits to people outside of death denial, things like community, connectedness, sense of belonging. But the one thing really that all religions have in common is offering some kind of solution to death. And so people will go to a lot of, extreme lengths, whether that's money, whether that's, again, the global conflicts that we've seen because of clashing religious beliefs, because religion does offer a literal immortality for them.
Yeah, I think it is quite interesting. But I actually went and researched some of the positive benefits of religion. You alluded to some of them there. A number of papers out there actually show that people who are involved in a religious practice actually live longer and have better health outcomes and better mental health than those who are not. Now, that's from the papers I saw. Is that conducive to what you've seen, or similar, or? So
I've seen papers with that conclusion. I wonder how much of that, though, is that what I just mentioned about that connection and belonging, that we know relationships are one of the biggest predictors of physical health, mental health in old age, that if you look at the quality of someone's relationships at age 50, you can predict how physically and mentally well they'll be at age 80.
Really?
And so I wonder how much of those findings about religion are really because people have better social supports. You know, if they're unwell, they have people to check in on them in a way that people who don't have a religious congregation or community might not have. So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head.
Yeah, there's some really books that have been extremely impactful on me in recent years have been books around that concept of human connection, and books, particular books that essentially highlight how so much of the modern psychology and mental health and social psychology research are basically highlighting things that would be almost kind of empirical evidence of what anthropologists would describe as basically our evolutionary past and deep human connection, and how basically without that any other aspects of health kind of become irrelevant to a certain extent, almost get overshadowed. So like books like there's a brilliant one like Lost Connections by Johann Hari about addiction, and there's a really nice one called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, who was a war reporter, and there's a really nice one by Rutger Bregman that came out last year, maybe called Humankind, and another one called The Second Mountain by David Brooks. And these are books that they were basically come around to the same theme constantly, which is what are other people feeling connected to us, such that not only are they in the war scenario with Tribe, and even in The Second Mountain, it's like what are you actually accomplishing anything for if it's just for you and not as part of a wider community or a tribe? Because when you look at our evolutionary past and Dunbar's number and our deep sense of social connection and how important that, or what that basically allowed to keep tribes together, and without that, and that's what we're basically wired for, is a contribution at our own expense often towards other people, and how that consistently seems to be a source of meaning and a direction, a purposeful direction for people's existence. You know, and like even research on things like the blue zones, you see that the people that live the longest, the most common thread, the diets vary hugely, the amount of exercise, etc. They're going to get more movement in a typical sedentary Western lifestyle, but the common thread amongst all the longest living places on Earth is deep social connection. That's like the most common thread, whether it be in Okinawa and the sense of community there, even when people retire, that they're given work to do in the community so that they feel like they're still contributing, or the Seventh-day Adventist Christians, or there's a load of different examples of these longest living. And it keeps coming back to.
I was going to say, Karen, this is such an interesting topic, because in this is across sports science and sleep as well, because in the sleep world, we're seeing that people basically, who do certain activities are sleeping better. But for example, it's like early morning sunlight or early light exposure is actually correlated with better sleep at night. And people are like, what do you mean? If I have sunlight in the morning, what's that got to do with sleep later on? Or people reporting reduced mental health, negative mental health outcomes from swimming in the ocean. People are like, oh, that's because I'm in the cold water. And then other people are saying, oh, well, actually after the swim in the morning, it's having the coffee and the social connections. So it's all those things, is getting up early and having a social activity. It's getting up early and having a routine every day, which is good for sleep, and sleeping if it's good mental health. The cold water obviously helps with inflammation. The early morning sunlight helps with regulating sleep and mood and anxiety. And then the coffee afterwards is good for that social connection. So how do we quantify the three of those things in one? We can quantify it with like maybe some wearable actigraphy and questionnaires and so on. But trying to attribute the weighting of those to each individual is virtually impossible. But it's just such an interesting point, to your point, Karen, is like these things all contribute and help at the end of the day.
Could I ask on that, just as a related point, and I haven't had a chance to read your book yet. I tried to get it on an audio book. Is it going to be coming out on an audiobook version at some point?
Yeah, it's on an audiobook in Australia. There is a plan for it to come out internationally at some point, but there's no exact date yet.
Yeah, I might just try and get the physical books. I wasn't going to have time to get the physical book before we chatted, and then I tried to get an audio, but I'm looking forward to reading it from all Ian's told me about it. And you might have talked about this in the book, and if so, I look forward to reading it. But it's something I really wanted to ask about is in relation to what I just said, or what we were just discussing about this kind of deep social connection. And the most interesting aspect, I think, of one of the most interesting aspects of this kind of like pro-social, self-sacrificial behavior toward other people is people who are, and this might very well be part of, the whole immortality project and part of the, like the terror management theory, valuable part of a meaningful world. But what would your thoughts be, or do you know of any research or your own particular opinions on, in particular, like a military situation where, or in a fire brigade situation, or in just an emergency situation happens, where people are very willing to put their lives at risk, not only for a colleague, if it's a military situation or a fire brigade, but for a total stranger, and are willing to go all in and jump in front of a train to throw a child out of the way, or in a military scenario, obviously there's a deep love and connection amongst soldiers in these groups, and they're willing to jump on grenades instantaneously for put their own body at risk, or fire brigade. So just on a surface level, without someone having an understanding of this idea of death anxiety, and if death anxiety and death and the denial of death was such a driver for the human condition, how is it that we're simultaneously wired for pro-social self-sacrifice at the same time? So would you have any thoughts on that, or can you talk to that a bit? Because I find it so fascinating. It's something that I can imagine people would be curious about, considering the strength of research on TMT.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So for listeners who aren't familiar with terror management theory, TMT broadly argues that we have an innate fear of death, and we develop all kinds of strategies to manage that. And the two main strategies that terror management theory proposes are cultural worldviews. So I buy into the beliefs of my culture, I buy into the value system, the cultural norms and values and beliefs of my culture, because my culture is going to outlive me. So I, as an individual, am going to last 86 years on average, if I'm lucky, but my culture is going to outlive me. And so by striving to be a valued member of my culture, by ticking the boxes, the achievements that my culture tells me are good things to do, that gives me a sense that I'm going to be remembered after my death, and that I've been a good member of my culture. And so this ties in with things like martyrdom, for example, where if my culture values self-sacrifice, whether that's my culture in terms of my national identity, my religious faith, or a kind of subculture, for example, if I'm part of a team of volunteers, for instance, if one of those values is self-sacrifice, then when I'm reminded of death, one of the things I'm going to want to do is strive to live up to that value of self-sacrifice. So, for example, there have been studies done in Middle Eastern countries with high Muslim populations where they look at martyrdom, and they find that when Muslim individuals are reminded of death, so they're given two kind of simple questions about, tell us what comes to mind when you think about death. So they're really subtly asked to just think about death, and then the researchers measure their behavior. And so when they prime Muslim participants with death, and then they give them some vignettes describing people who have, been martyrs for Islam, for example, people are much more supportive of martyrdom after they've been reminded of death. And we see this in other cultures as well, where people are much more willing to sacrifice themselves for their country in war, for instance, after they've been primed with death. So this seems to suggest that on an unconscious level, these fears of death are driving people to do things that will mean their culture will celebrate and remember them, because that's their attempt at getting some kind of sense of significance and achievement in the face of death.
Yeah, because it seems like such a paradoxical situation, but when you bring it down to that level, on the terror management theory, the self-esteem bit and the cultural worldview bit, or the valuable part and the meaningful world bit, then it makes total sense once you bring it down to actually go into the weeds a bit and see becomes totally relevant. Yeah.
Yeah.
This chapter also kind of reminded me, because a few days later I was in Kings Park, which is a massive park here in Perth. It reminded me of you guys still there? Yep, had a bit of a glitch. This chapter, or that question there as well. In this chapter, I think around clinging to culture and some of the stuff, Rachel, you said reminded me of some of the stuff that we see in Kings Park in Perth. Kings Park is a massive park, and in different sections of the park and down the driveways, it's got like little tiny plaques at the bottom of trees that basically will say, like, you know, Corporal Kieran Dunican, right, died 1916 in the Great War, aged 17, Albany, Western Australia. And you see that there on those things, and you're like, wow, this is unbelievable. Like, and it makes me sad and really proud at the one time to see that somebody be willing to give their life care, like what you said. So in some ways they do kind of live on in an odd fashion, but it's a tragedy that it even had to happen, right? But it's also, you know, you kind of go through all those mental gymnastics. What would the world be like if these things didn't happen? Or what would the world be like if these people didn't go to war, and so on? And we even see it, Kieran, in Ireland with like 1916, when Ireland, you know, fought for its freedom, and you know, these remembrance statues around Ireland or all things as well. And it made me start thinking about all of these present day things that are happening where statues are being taken down, and you like think like, oh, should we take it down? Should we leave it? And then you start going back into the past, and when the Roman Empire fell, the Catholic Church took down Roman statues. So this has been happening for like 2,000 years, where we've been putting these statues up, having this culture, having this war stuff. It's been constantly going on for thousands of years, and it evokes for me a range of emotions of being sad, being proud, being angry at all those people that have died and there was a waste. And you try and do the whole equation of what the benefits of war, and you kind of go, it actually ends up being no benefit at the end, you know. And that's coming from someone who's been a soldier and ex-soldier. So, and obviously being a bit older, I think you go through different phases of thinking it's justified, not justified. So I find that interesting as well, that I'm kind of rambling here, and this is not really a question, it was more of a comment on Kieran's, but it's interesting too how that changes across your life and where you are as well, about would you jump on the grenade, Kieran, at a certain time in your life or in a certain job? Because I think if you ask a civilian to do that, they'd be like, there's no way I'm jumping on a grenade for some random guy across the road, you know. So it's really interesting how that culture, you know,
but at the same time
breeds that.
But at the same time, you have civilian scenarios where it's not necessarily a grenade, but it's particularly, it seems like with males, are more conducive to like impulsive, sudden physical things, like jumping in front, like use an example, like jump onto the train tracks to throw a toddler up who's just fell over or whatever. Whereas you come across examples in like that spring to mind of like Nazi occupied France or whatever, where people to hide Jews in the basement or in the attic or whatever, and they're willing to lie to SS search parties, putting all their loved ones at line for a family that they don't even know that lived a while away and was trying to get away. So those kind of scenarios are unbelievably interesting. And I think I don't know, I can't help but think that prosocial element is like there's really something to that around mental health and well-being, like Rachel was alluding to, around that connection, that feeling of connection and that self-sacrifice and what that feeds into from a TMT perspective. But could I just, for one follow-up to that, Rachel, is with TMT, and like you described it, like the amount of studies, like it might have been more than 1,000 studies the last time I went down the rabbit hole a bit. And it was like 500 odd studies by the time that the Worm at the Core, Solomon and Greenberg and Pazinski's book was published. And that was like published in 2014 or 15. And then when I was writing about it last year and I was down the rabbit hole a bit, there was nearly 1,000 or more than 1,000 studies from all over the world, loads of different cultures that were all kind of providing, confirming evidence to this kind of theory off the back of Ernest Becker's work. And to me, I kind of almost, it ticks a lot of boxes, and it ticks a load of biases that I'd already have from stuff that we talked about offline around my interest in Stoicism and death meditation and Buddhism, and particularly samurai culture. But I'm kind of, maybe it's like the scientific thinker, kind of critical thinking element of me. I'm kind of wired to, the more I want something to be true, the more wary I am of my own belief or my own idea. And when it comes to term management theory, the evidence is so vast from so many different cultures and so many different scenarios, from so many different modalities, whether it be subliminal messaging or whether it be standing someone in front of a funeral home versus 100 meters away, or whether it be asking them direct questions to talk about their feelings on death and what it would be like after they die, etc. Those very simple questions that are used. But then it almost feels too good to be true. Like it almost feels like a kind of a unified theory of psychology to a certain extent. And in that, what kind of concerns me, and we had numerous guests on talking about this early on in the podcast, where we had people from the Ernest Becker Foundation and the official biographer for Ernest Becker on to talk about it. And something that I was really interested in was that, like, and Becker writes about this in Denial of Death, around Freud constantly being able to boil something down to, it's just sex, basically. It's the Oedipal complex or the castration complex, and they just dial it down to those two things. And no matter what happened, he could bring it back. But obviously he didn't have the empirical evidence to say that. That was just, he was fitting the world to his ideas rather than adjusting his ideas in relation to feedback from the world. And it seems like that there's such explanatory power with TMT and so much evidence supporting it from all over the world that it makes it increasingly likely that there's something very strong signal in there. And I was wondering if, first of all, if you had any thoughts on that element of it, in terms of how strong this is, or how effective a predictive theory this is on sociology and psychology and individual level, but also what are the kind of strongest critiques that you have come across on terror management theory, that there might be something to that's worth looking into, or critiques that might help to strengthen terror management theory research going forward? Because that seems to me, it seems so powerful and so useful. I'm deadly curious at what the most robust critiques are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So to answer the first part of the question, in which I think is in terms of clarifying, I guess, the robustness of the evidence. So you're right, there have been at least 300 studies that I know of that have shown these effects, these kind of mortality salience priming effects. And in research in general, there's often what's known as publication bias. Where typically, so if you find the effect you're after, journals want to publish it, you'll get published. If you don't find what you're after, if you find you do your big experiment, nothing happens, people aren't interested. So journals don't tend to publish it. And then there's what's called the file drawer effect, where all of these sort of non-significant findings just get tucked away in the laboratory in the file drawer, and they never actually reach the journals and the research community and so on. So generally in research, there's this problem where only the significant findings get published and anything else doesn't get seen. When the one way to look at how much publication bias is playing out in research is to do what's called a meta-analysis and look at all of the studies together and almost plot visually the effects, and then to look at, is there sort of a gap, so to speak? Is there a gap where we would there's sort of a distribution of effects and there's a spot on the graph where there are no effects coming up, which would suggest that findings aren't being published that we would expect to find, if that makes sense. That's a long-winded way of me saying that the one meta-analysis that's been done on terror management theory, which was by Burke in 2010, found very little evidence of publication bias, that TMT in some ways is a bit of an outlier where there is less of a worry about these non-significant effects not appearing, that it just seems like there are less non-significant effects in TMT. I remember when I was first doing research in this area, the first experiment I ever did, which was for my honors thesis, my supervisor, his jaw almost hit the floor because he was so shocked, having worked in social psychology for decades. He was so shocked by the size of the effect. This was my first experiment, which was looking at people with OCD. And we found that when people with OCD were given these subtle reminders of death, they spent twice as long washing their hands compared to people who hadn't been given this reminder of death. And this was completely outside of conscious awareness. They had no idea we were even looking at fears of death. We just gave them these primes, gave them a bunch of questionnaires, and then told them that we were going to be measuring their skin electricity. So we put some gel on their fingers to do that. But what we were really interested in was how long do they spend washing their hands afterwards. They didn't even know we were recording how long they were at the sink, but we were. And long story short, we found that the people that had been given death reminders spent twice as long washing their hands. Twice as long to listeners might not sound like a drastically big change, but statistically, this was a massive effect that most people, you might spend 20, 30 years doing psychology research and never see an effect of that magnitude. And each mortality salient study I've done since then, we've seen really similar, huge relationships, which, I think shows that fears of death in general have such a big effect on people, but they have a particularly big effect on people with mental health difficulties. So that's again, a long-winded way of saying that I agree there is such a large body of evidence for terror management theory. And I personally am surprised every single time at the size of the effects that we find in this literature. In terms of criticisms of terror management theory, the most common one, I suppose, would be, I'm going to mess up the name, the meaning management framework, meaning management model. I should probably know that, but that's a kind of alternative perspective on terror management theory, which is the idea that it's not death itself that is the challenge to people. It's generally a loss of meaning, and that death is one way in which our sense of kind of purpose and structure in the world is challenged or threatened. That would be the sort of opposing perspective on terror management theory, but at least to my knowledge, there's less research on it, and it's a bit more niche, I would say, than terror management.
Rachel, that actually is a nice segue, because you discussed that experiment in the book, and I read it and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And the first thing I thought about was coronavirus. I thought about how people are crazy with hand sanitizing, social distancing, masks, and just being like completely over the top. But not being over the top the whole time, only over the top when the government says it's time to be over the top. Like, we had some flowers delivered today. My wife came out of surgery and I opened the door and the guy was like, "Can you stand back, please?" And I was like, "I don't have a gun, relax." And he's just like, he stood back, not 1.5 meters, but about 5 meters. And I was like, oh, like, this is just crazy. And I was actually thinking, is some people, because there is people freaking out about coronavirus. Like, people are walking around going, it's everywhere, it's everywhere. People are holding their breath walking by people, like going, people are running with masks on and face shields. They can't even see, and they're going to run into traffic and die. You know, the coronavirus.
Running, exercising, running.
Yes. I have on the weekend, I saw a lady with a face mask and a face shield running.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
So there's, I see, and I think, just for context, and it sounds funny, in Western Australia, regardless of your politics, but people have been fear mongered here into thinking that they're going to die. Like, I would say probably I would say maybe 7 to 8 out of 10 people think that they're going to die if they get coronavirus. That I speak to, they actually think that, like, it's death is imminent. They're going to breathe in something and then they're going to die. So part of it's obviously fear mongering by the government, right? But my question, I suppose, is for some people, is this just amplified their fear of death, or has that been an underlying fear of death all along, where they're just not being conscious of it? And now that it's at to the forefront, they're like, ah, because people have said to me, "Oh, what are you going to do if you get coronavirus?" Like, I'll die. Like, if you're saying you die, I'll die. Oh, and someone said to me, "But won't you regret it?" I'm like, "I'll be dead." I'm like, guys, I served in the military. I've traveled around the world. I do martial arts. I've been in some crazy environments with people shooting at me. Like, I have under no illusion I'm going to live forever. But these people are like, "I can't believe you live like that." It's like, I can't believe you don't. Like, I wasn't born to live forever. So yeah, what do you think about that, Rachel, with the COVID-19 stuff?
Yeah, I mean, COVID's been really interesting because, like we've been saying, in social psychology, we do these experiments in laboratories where we give people brief, subtle reminders of death, measure their response in the experiment, and then send them on their merry ways. And in COVID, we're seeing this all sort of play out. Everything we do in our labs, we see play out in the real world, where we're essentially all living in this mortality salience experiment on a constant basis for 2 years. I mean, you could not, as a researcher, think of a better experimental design than this. And I think we see exactly that. I think we see, people going down two camps. Some people go down the path of sort of desperately trying to prevent death however they can, not leaving their homes. Obviously, in lockdowns, you don't leave your homes, but some people would continue to do that. And then people doing the alternative of just denial, people, not getting vaccinated, or people, not wanting to wear masks and just saying that it's a conspiracy or a scam or whatever else, where we see this kind of clear denial or clear avoidance. And it's really hard. And then we see other things as well with COVID. In the early stages of COVID, we saw a lot of people becoming aggressive to people of other races or other ethnicities, particularly people of Asian background. The COVID was called the China virus. And that's exactly what terror management theory would predict, that people cling to their nationality and they aggress against people who are different to them. So COVID's been a really interesting experience from that point of view. And, like you said, a lot of people have become a lot more anxious, and we've seen a huge surge in mental health problems. And part of that is, I think undeniably, because of death now being at the forefront of everyone's minds. And I think also part of that is the lack of connection, the social isolation, the financial stress of people losing their jobs, that it's just a sort of perfect storm of everything that we know is bad for mental health.
Yeah. And I think now, Rachel, you're probably seeing, like, I would argue that it's not as binary as what you stated in terms of like kind of for and against in that respect. I think there's actually a whole slew of people in the middle, where there's some people, particularly like here in Western Australia, we're now seeing fractions happening where people are like, well, we all got vaccinated, we all follow the rules, and the state's still not open, and we still have to now do all this stuff. So, this was all a complete lie. And that, in actual fact, the people who were more compliant, would say, and were trying to, play the game, they're actually now gone back to 2 years ago and gone, this is a conspiracy theory. So they're like for 2 years ago, because they're seeing all these things not being, so you can't really, I think now, you can't look at the world and say, oh, coronavirus, pro-vax, anti-mandates and pro-vax and pro-vax and pro-mandates and anti-vax and anti-mandates. I think now the whole thing has got turned upside down, because each state, each territory, each province, like in Canada, each country, you're seeing a whole different thing emerge. Like, it's just really interesting to talk to people overseas. I know a lot of people in the US who will be like far left, like typical kind of woke academic type people. And they were like, well, why can't you come to this conference? I'm like, because I can't. They're like, why don't you just get vaccinated? I'm like, well, if I am, what does it matter if I'm not? But I said, okay, I'm vaccinated. Well, then just come along. I'm like, no, you don't understand. We can't leave. And they're like, what? Oh, that's like blah, 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 blah. So now they would have jumped like from pro-vax, pro-mandates to anti-vax, anti-mandates by that statement straight away. So it's this kind of like, every place is so different. And it's just, I find it fascinating to see this all play out. And I often think about the denial of death and how people are constantly switching and terrified of this outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely don't think it's black and white. I do think you see denial in different ways. Like, some people might be in denial about their own vulnerability, or they might be in denial about other people's vulnerability. They might just underestimating that maybe they're right and it won't kill them, but it might kill the other person, next to them at that event or whatnot. And it's tricky, because you're having to juggle, one attitude would be, well, we need to accept death and focus on quality of life and focus on helping people, enjoy the time that they do have, like your point about, not wanting, you were mentioning earlier, not wanting to miss out on things and doing martial arts and things that give you clearly a sense of enjoyment and purpose, even though there's that risk of injury. So it's tricky. You're having to juggle all these different values about how much do we value giving people the best quality of life versus keeping people safe. And it's particularly difficult at the end of life, where you see people in nursing homes or people in hospital and palliative care who are dying, and because of COVID and COVID restrictions, they aren't able to be with loved ones when they die. And clearly the medical system and those sectors are prioritizing extending life, prioritizing keeping people safe over ensuring they have a good death with their loved ones around them. So it's tricky. I don't think there's a clear, easy answer.
It's because so much of it is, it seems like and it's something we talked about with Seamus and Mahoney as well, which is so much of our health system is based on what is quantifiable. And you can quantify how long someone has a pulse, but you can't quantify even I was supposed to use the word we use around, like the meaning and the what do you call it? The valence of their experience. Like what's the amount of positive valence of their experience in their last few days, and what's the benefit of that, or maybe even the last few weeks or few months, and the benefit of that valence to them in terms of human experience, what it means to live a good life and how to die well. And that's how do you, like, it's like the beginning of the Tao Te Ching of like the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. It's like whatever the optimizing function is for the human condition you can't put that in a metric. Whatever it is, that's the meaning of existence, whatever the thing that kind of creates the kind of states of mind that are most full of meaning aren't what we can put a number on, but we can put numbers on how many days someone is alive or how much, how many days extra, weeks extra, months extra, a particular medication gives. And as a result, it kind of becomes this kind of notion, our health system is very focused on, quite atomistically, kind of if what can be measured is what's important, kind of simplistic about it.
And I think, there would certainly be ways of measuring people's emotional experience at the end of life, but it's almost built into the medical system that there's a failure. Letting someone die is a failure of the medical system, and this is why it's so hard to get, euthanasia and things approved, that it means people... we know, we talk about this in the book, that the doctors will admit to providing futile treatments. They will provide treatments that they know will not do anything to save a person's life, because they think the family want that, because they think the family aren't going to accept the death, or because there's just a general sense of this is what you do. You fight to extend someone's life, even if it comes at a huge cost in terms of their quality of life, their comfort, their ability to actually appreciate that time comfortably.
I couldn't agree with you more on them. It's because, and this, you might really enjoy that chat we had with Seamus. You're ringing so many bells here, and that book, Can Medicine Be Cured? And this is a lot of that is about this, because his first book was How We Die Now. But as an example, to use the impact of terror management or the impact of the mortality salience on culture, I think the most dramatic example to me is the US, because the US is like this kind of almost pantomime taking place at the center of the world's attention, the Western world at least. And the illustration to me is, when the terror management theory, for anyone who isn't familiar with, is listening to it, basically that like with death reminders, people kind of dig their heels in on the cultural worldview and dig their heels in on stereotypes, whatever because those stereotypes are part of a cultural worldview. So with the George Floyd death, for example, if there's a huge chunk of America who think of the American law enforcement as having particular biases against African Americans and being more ruthless and more aggressive, etc., and then they have 3 months of mortality reminders on a daily basis, of death reminders constantly and in the media for like March, April, May, and then people are locked up in their homes and their normal support networks, like you wrote about in the paper about mourning. That you had was it a paper? It was your paper about, was it mourning and loss, death and loss in COVID-19?
Grief and loss, yeah.
Grief and loss, yeah. So you mentioned, in that paper, if I remember correctly, you mentioned the kind of loss of support networks, and you specifically mentioned people dying and not being able to be with the loved ones while they were dying, and how the support networks were all fragmented and broken up because of social isolation or social distancing restrictions and separation. And then when you have that, you have with the George Floyd scenario as the first part, you have that. You have this mortality salience on a daily basis, which is going to just instantiate and deepen cultural worldviews according to TMT. And then you have an event happens that is actually in itself a mortality reminder because a man actually dies in a video. And then that then firms as a twofold, an actual death reminder in and of itself, but also that confirms the worldview, which is police are, this take on law enforcement being a particularly biased and using more likely to use lethal violence, etc., against Black people. And then that then, to me, is a TMT could have very well predicted quite easily what was going to happen off the back of that. And then you ended up with, but then it became like this self-fulfilling, self-turning wheel where the narrative that was in place then meant that evidence that kind of showed any kind of a bad light on things that went on, even though nearly all the protests were peaceful. There was a load of them that got really violent and messy and riots, etc. And those protests, the ones that turned into riots and there was violence and all this kind of stuff where people were killed and things were looted, etc., that didn't make it into the media sources that were of the kind of worldview that the George Floyd video would have reaffirmed, because they didn't want to be kind of questioning their own story. So then it meant that the only place that evidence showed up as is on the other side of the spectrum, which was like, say, the Fox News or whatever, became the only place that was showing that. So then there was months and months of videos of riots and violence and talks about retired police officers who were security workers in shops or in malls, etc., who died in riots or died in violence with Antifa or supposed Black Lives Matter supporters. That was never reported in the kind of, let's say, the more progressive or democratic sources, but it only got reported in the place where it's going to be blown up in total other direction, as if all the protests are turning into violent riots. And then because that fit their kind of worldview is, look, this stuff is only anti-American hatred, etc. And then that exacerbates and builds. And a couple of days, and that was like 5 or 6 months of that, then just before the American election, that potentially helped Trump to get so many votes, because there was kind of this stuff that wasn't touched on one side because it questioned their worldview, that was getting continually deepened and instantiated by mortality reminders because the pandemic was still going. And then I ended up publishing an essay in the day before the American election, and early November, maybe, or late December, whatever, the day before, 2 days before. And I basically used the TMT framework to basically say, which wasn't going to be that hard to predict, and maybe even without TMT, you could predict it, that basically, if Trump loses, the amount of death reminders and threats to cultural worldview that have taken place, that people who would have been Trump supporters would have seen since the George Floyd death, because of all the shadow side of some of these protests that was only publicized on one side of a media spectrum. There's pretty much inevitable there's going to be a violent pushback. And there's going to be, if Trump was to lose, there's going to be a big problem. And even if Trump wins, this is just going to keep getting worse on this other side, and whatever violence was taking place. So it was like the TMT framework became so immediately apparent on explaining what was happening, but then also predicting January 6th, what was going to happen there with the storming of the Capitol. There's going to be a pushback here, because there's a pressure cooker building here that's really understandable given the TMT framework. So I thought at the 2020 and early 2021 with that January 6th thing was just like, it was an unbelievable, for considering I'd only come across terror management theory and Ernest Becker's work in 2020, in the summer of 2020. It just became such an unbelievably interesting lens to view what was going on in America as this kind of, I was here in Ireland and you were there in Australia. I'd imagine watching America seeming like it was going to tear itself apart on the kind of the center of the world stage.
And may do yet.
It might do yet. Yeah. It became like a case study, a really interesting case study. So do you have any thoughts on that, or my bit of a ramble there? But I just found it such an interesting situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good example of how we're surrounded by all of these reminders of death, whether it's George Floyd or whether, every day we hear about natural disasters or shootings or, or car accidents, or, you know, whether it's these reminders of death. And most of us aren't aware of how unconsciously it's impacting so much of what we do, including things like who we vote for, which we know reminders of death change who people say they want to vote for. Even weeks before an election, people will still change their mind based on this subtle reminder of death in an experiment. And this is why in Mortals we talk a lot about the importance of understanding these unconscious processes, because once we can understand how our fears of death are leading us to cling to our culture or to aggress against people with different political views, for instance, it opens up the door for us to think about, do we still really want to do these things that we're doing? That being aware of the impact of death and working to try and accept death is really the key to helping us live more authentically and helping us live more in line with our own values, rather than necessarily buying into the values of our culture or our subculture.
And is that what you'd say would be the main benefits to even independent of decreasing death anxiety, is that to even learn about the tendencies that we would have in response to death reminders, or to be able to identify certain frames of mind or lenses that we might have, which is, if we can pay attention to the fact that I'm now holding prejudice against, a more aggressive prejudice against someone who has a different political worldview or is from a different country or whatever, that to use that to go, okay, why is that? And then to just even be aware of that probing. And so from both directions, that death reminders are going to do this to me and going to increase my, to use kind of Jungian language, I like to think of as like shadow projection. You know, that there's a kind of I don't know how familiar you are with the kind of that term, but basically to kind of Carl Jung, there was this kind of, they use that language of the shadow projection, and basically that what we most fear about what we most dislike about other people is what we most fear is coming from a place of what we most fear in ourselves. And I think that concept, and again, it's got to do with the kind of unconscious projection. So what it might very well be about another person that we most dislike or hate, maybe even in a really heated scenario, is actually coming from a place of what we most fear in ourselves, which very well could be existential dread. Is the fact that if this person has a different religion and a different ethnic background and a different cultural worldview than me, but I've now had my sense of identity and sense of my cultural worldview is actually, it's important for me to buffer my existential dread, but by virtue of existence in my proximity, these people are questioning the worldview that I believe to be the view of the world that makes the most sense. So that, I suppose I went on a bit of a ramble there, but is that what you'd see as the main benefit of, one of the main benefits of TMT, is that, or some of the insights of TMT, is allowing us to identify when we're potentially being led astray by death anxieties? Yeah,
that's right. So if I can identify what's in general, in psychology and clinical psychology, if we think about therapy, often a large part of therapy is helping people understand what's motivating their actions. Why are they doing the things they're doing? Why are they going after a particular romantic partner time and time again? Why are they striving so hard at work, for instance? And the reason we try and do that in therapy is because if we can understand what's motivating our behaviors or why we're doing the things we're doing, it's much easier to try and change behaviors that we want to change. And if we take a really kind of day-to-day example with death anxiety, let's say, for example, that I'm very ambitious. I'm always striving for the next promotion. I'm trying to kind of climb my career ladder. I'm trying to outperform all of my co-workers. If I can see that one thing driving that behavior is my desire to be seen as the kind of cream of the crop, to be seen as the best performer, to be remembered as someone who achieved, who was very successful, who earned a lot of money, who had the nicest car on the street. If I can see that it's my fear of death motivating that it's my desire to feel significant and special, and if I can realize that all of those things ultimately are going to fail, because I might be remembered for a few generations, let's say, if I'm lucky, but ultimately I'm not going to be remembered for very long in the scheme of human history. that gives me a lot more freedom to really think about, how do I actually want to live my life? Is this striving in my career, for instance, is that really what I want to do? Or would I prefer to be, would I get more kind of intrinsic enjoyment out of spending that time with people I care about, or pursuing a hobby like running or fishing or whatever it is? That once we can start to understand, this is why I'm striving so much at work, this is why I spend money on luxury goods, it opens up the door to help me think about, what do I authentically actually want to do? Do I need to keep buying into what my culture tells me I should do? Or can I try and carve out my own path for myself? If I can recognize I have only so many years on this planet, and it's really completely up to me, with some practical constraints, how I spend that time, it's much more rewarding and freeing in a lot of ways than living with this kind of specter of denial that this is all one day going to make me immortal.
I think on that point as well, Rachel, like in a roundabout way, this is something I ask myself a lot, or when people say to me, if you had X amount of million, 20 million, you didn't have to work again, what would you do? And 9 times out of 10, my answer is, depends on the week, but you could have a bad week, is I was like, I keep doing what I'm doing now because I really enjoy what I'm doing. And it's like, I'm not doing it for, and it's always, I think it's an interesting thing to have a look at your own life and see, am I doing these things because I want to be tough, like martial arts? So I want to like beat up people and be known as someone who won a lot of fights. Well, no, because I don't compete. I do it because I like working out the puzzle, and it's an infinite game. We have infinite games and finite games, but it's an infinite game that can just keep going on and on, as Kieran would allude to as well. And the process of just constantly being in that free fall of learning is just invigorating to me. And I often think that, am I pursuing things for the sake of collecting tokens to show people how good I was? And it's easy. I get into that trap myself. Oh yeah, it'd be awesome if I did this and this and this. Well, why? Like, if you're really interested in something, do you need to go and get a master's degree in it or develop a business doing that? If you're really interested in it, just understand it and learn it yourself. Because I had a bit of a gripe, I think, with one of your chapters. My back got up over it, and I was like, oh, why is my back getting up over this? And I was about the exercise and the vitamins thing. And for many years, I would run like ultra marathons up to like 100-mile races. I picked one in the Colorado Rockies at altitude. And then I was like, last year 2 years ago, I had spinal surgery. Within 16 weeks, I ran 80 Ks in a race. And then 6 months after that, then I swam to an island 20 Ks away. And I thought, oh, was I doing it because of death? I was like, no, actually, I was doing it for the reasons that was right. It was like, it was milestones and markers to get me back, and not to be, self-pity and to get out of that hole. But then I started thinking about the runs I was doing for years and years. And I think some of that probably was a kind of not a denial of death, but a kind of I'm doing this to tick a box. And then, because people would say to me, so why aren't you doing that race you did last year? You ran those 4 last year. And I was like, whoa, I'm not running this for you guys. And I was getting caught up in that whole thing of like, I became the person that did all these ultra runs every year. I became the person that did all these things. And I was going, actual fact, I did those for like 7, 8, 9 years. I really enjoyed them, but I've had enough of them now. And I'm going to move on to something else that I enjoy, because if I keep doing that, I'm just collecting tokens. So other people go, well done. And I think it's dangerous. I think it's really dangerous. I had that reflection. That's why I got my back got up reading that chapter about doing exercise and vitamins and stuff, because I thought, well, I'm just doing it because of quality of life. It's not about death denial. What's it about quality of life? And then I was like, I'm gonna talk to Rachel about this. And I was like, then I thought about it. I was like, in actual fact, I probably was just collecting tokens at the time, but now I've kind of come back. And I think if you understand, and you just said that, if you understand it's not a death denial, then it's fine.
Yeah, that's right. That there are lots of reasons why we do the things we do. And exercise is a good example of that clearly there are benefits to exercise outside of it extending lifespan, or people's perceptions that it will extend their lifespan. And if people, exercise because of the joy it brings them, because it helps them connect with, other people in their yoga class or their running group, then that's great. But, obviously for some people, the exercise is in that belief that I'm going to keep my heart healthy and strong, and this is going to keep me alive. And the vitamin industry is another great example of that, where, there's so much evidence that vitamins do not actually do anything really to keep people healthy. And yet this is a multi-million dollar industry where you see there are vitamin companies that are literally called life extension. How they can get away with calling themselves that, I don't know, because we know that vitamins don't extend people's lives, but people will pay however many dollars in the belief that taking these supplements is going to help keep them alive for a fraction longer.
Yeah, I was just on that point. Sorry, Karen, one second. People often say to me about like David Sinclair, who has all this longevity stuff, and people get surprised where I go, I'm actually not interested in longevity. I'm interested in quality and utilization of my time and living every day to its max. I'm not interested in obsessing about 20 years time from now. Did you ever hear Billy Connolly's bit on being gluten-free?
No.
Billy Connolly's got this great thing about, they say give up gluten, it adds years to your life. I looked up the research, says like adds 2 or 3 years. Oh, that's great. He says, when I'm shaking, he says, and shitting my pants in an old folks home, he says, I get another 3 years of doing that as opposed to just dying because I didn't eat gluten.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think, again, if we paid as much attention to quality of life as to length of life, quantity of life, the world would be a very different place. Nursing homes would be very different. Hospitals would look very different. People would actually be having conversations about end-of-life preferences, how they want to die, making, end-of-life plans or advanced care directives. But unfortunately, those are conversations that people don't often have until it's too late to have those conversations.
Yeah. Sorry, Karen.
No, just it's somewhat of a related question to what we just discussed. There was actually, and it relates to, first of all, the benefits of death anxiety, the benefits of decreased death anxiety. But then, how do we actually, and this feeds into potentially quality of life as well, of course, is methods of actually overcoming death anxiety from a clinical perspective and research and where they cross over. And I suppose what I could, as a little point, is I noticed in your paper on the grief and mourning one, or death and what was it called? It was death and loss, or grief and
I couldn't even tell you.
We can include it in the show notes.
Yeah. I'm the same. So as people go, oh, your paper that was called, I'm like, was it? I can't remember if it was called that.
It was something like death anxiety in the time of COVID, loss, grief, something.
Yeah. That's why the words are getting a jumble in my head.
Yeah, it was.
Because I noticed. Sorry. I just noticed in the beginning that you mentioned, or you quoted, there was a line in it from Irvin Yalom, and I noticed that because I'm quite a fan of Yalom's writings and existential psychotherapy, and he wrote one of my favorite books ever, which is actually a fiction book called When Nietzsche Wept, and because I'm quite a fan of a lot of Friedrich Nietzsche's writing, and he's my favorite madman, that's a wonderful.
What about me?
Yeah, but I was wondering, because I know that some of the existential psychotherapy stuff that he would have written about and talked about, I think made its way into the back of The Worm at the Core as well. So I'm just basically providing new context to a question here that I maybe didn't need to give, but basically, as a practitioner and someone who's obviously you're an expert in this area, in terms of methods of overcoming death anxiety, what works from a clinical perspective, or what has been shown in the research that you found interesting?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we now know that cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, is the most effective way of reducing death anxiety. So this came from a meta-analysis I did in 2018, I believe, where we looked at all these different treatments for death anxiety, and CBT was really the only treatment that came out which seemed to actually be able to reduce fears of death. And what seemed to be, so CBT, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, involves looking at our cognition, so our beliefs and thoughts, in this case, beliefs and thoughts about death, and our behavior. So how does our behavior maintain our anxiety? And the main types of CBT that came up in that meta-analysis were exposure therapy. So what seems to be most effective at reducing people's fears of death is gradually facing those fears. And this is consistent with what we've known for anxiety for a very long time, probably 100 years, that when we're anxious about something, our typical response is to try and avoid it. So if I'm anxious about dogs, I'm going to not go to a friend's house if they have a dog. I might not go to parks. But in terms of treating that anxiety, the most effective thing is to actually face the fear and face the things that we typically avoid. It might seem strange to compare that to death, but it's the same kind of process, that the more we start to actually face reminders of death, sit through films about death, for example, read books about death, go to cemeteries, face the things we would usually avoid, the more we start to learn to tolerate the anxiety that comes up around death and start to cultivate acceptance around death, to normalize it. So this could look like, as I just mentioned, going to places we associate with death, hospitals, cemeteries, funeral homes, even just talking about death, so that might be talking to loved ones about, do we want to be buried or cremated, listening to music or podcasts about death, anything that really seeks to cultivate that acceptance. And this is something that the Stoics have obviously done, were doing thousands of years ago. Ideas like memento mori, the idea of negative visualization, forcing ourselves to imagine bad things that we fear happening. Stoics practiced this for a long time, as did the Buddhists. The Buddhists would, meditate on, and still do meditate on, the image of their own corpse decaying, for instance, to really normalize it and drive home that point. And so these sorts of strategies, it doesn't mean everyone has to go off and just sit for 3 hours picturing their corpse decaying, but anything that gets people facing that fear seems to be effective. So this is the sort of thing we would work on in clinical practice, and also things like looking at people's beliefs about death. So, does someone fear death because they think it's going to be painful? Do they fear death because they think, do they fear other people's death because they worry they won't be able to cope without losing a loved one? And really trying to look at, how true are these beliefs? How realistic are they? How helpful are they? And are there more helpful alternative beliefs that we can seek to cultivate?
It's funny you mentioned the Stoics, as just when you said that it's CBT and particular exposure therapy, I immediately thought about, there's a friend of mine is a sports psychologist, and he kind of, I believe it was him that kind of filled me in a bit at one point on the kind of the origins of CBT, because he uses it, but he's quite a fan of, I can't remember the guy's name, but he developed a school of EBT that came before CBT, emotional behavioral therapy, which was developed off the back of Stoicism. So it was like earlier in the 20th century. I can't remember the guy's name.
Albert Ellis developed therapy, and interestingly, Aaron Beck or Tim Beck, who developed CBT, both of them wrote about basing it on Stoicism. So the roots of, if you were to walk into a therapist's office, most likely that therapist would practice CBT. And unbeknownst to that therapist, the roots of that therapy are in Stoicism, but it's not something that you would come across ever in your training unless you happen to also do philosophy.
Yeah, cool. Because with exposure therapy, and like I mentioned Marcus Aurelius earlier on, I think when we were off mic, but there's one of my favorite lines. It's basically exposure therapy. Marcus Aurelius wrote about 2,000 years ago in the Meditations, where he said, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way, where basically resistance is an opportunity for progress.
Yeah.
So it was basically, the obstacle is the way is another way that it's been shortened down by Ryan Holiday in that title of that book. And that's basically exposure therapy. It's like the things that offer the most resistance are where the opportunities for the most growth is. And that was a big part of Stoicism. So just thinking about it there, of course, like the amount of research on exposure therapy, and even thinking about death meditation as a form of exposure therapy, independent of actually, typically when you hear of exposure therapy, you might hear therapists talk about it in podcasts or psychologists. It's in relation to someone who is in a fear of needles, and then the therapist might start with a needle, and they might tell the patient, there's a needle in a drawer in the next room, and you're welcome to go into that room if you want. That's this kind of a process, and eventually it's got to do with, but even it never occurred to me as actual meditation on a subject or visualizing it as a form of exposure therapy. Of course it is, because how can there's parts of our brain that can't know any different? So that's fascinating.
That's right. And you see it's a strategy that's been used in treatment for trauma for quite a long time. So in PTSD, where the source of the fear is the person's memories, their experience of the trauma, you obviously can't make someone, nor would you want to, actually go through that trauma again as exposure. So what you'll do instead is get them to do what's called imaginal exposure, where they will remember in vivid detail what happened to them in the trauma. And it's the same sort of idea of helping to kind of desensitize them and help them habituate and learn to tolerate the anxiety. So it's been used, that idea of imagining things that we fear has been used in other kind of frameworks, but it's really only in the last couple of years that we now have evidence that it works effectively for death as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, I'm just on a topic of PTSD. I want to just kind of just insert this comment here before I make this other comment, but I had a guy on my podcast recently called Shane Credo on my Sleep for Performance podcast. He's written a book about sleep for peak performance for athletes, but he also, like yourself, Rachel, he works in, sort of clinical practice, does some research, and then sees patients as well as a psychiatrist and so on. And he's actually was just saying that he works with a lot of like top psychiatrists in the world, people who've done stuff around near-death experiences and so on. So that book, Many Lives, Many Masters, he's worked with those psychiatrists. I think Brian Weiss is his name. Anyway, recent stuff coming out has shown that after a traumatic event, that one of the best ways to stop PTSD is sleep deprivation, which is contrary to what we would think, because during sleep, obviously memories are consolidated. So if you consolidate that memory really quickly after a traumatic event, it's kind of stuck there. Whereas if you stay awake, and so myself and Shane were talking about this, and I want to explore this more with Shane, about if you keep people awake, but then go through cognitive behavioral therapy with them at the same time, would that actually help? Because you see all those studies coming out of John Hopkins with MDMA or ketamine and PTSD. So I think like 5 facilitated sessions of CBT and MDMA, ecstasy, 5 sessions, people basically cured, so to speak, of PTSD or can live a normal life. So it's really interesting seeing all these things, just as you mentioned PTSD. The other thing, Rachel, have you ever heard of a guy called Kevin O'Toole? He's written a book called My Father's Wake, How the Irish Can Teach Us to Live and Die, I think it's called.
Oh, the title rings a bell. I haven't read it, but the title rings a bell.
Very good. He talks about what you talk about there and what you spoke about, Karen. He is a Scottish guy, but he used to spend a lot of time in Ireland growing up. And he talks about his exposure to death. Like in Irish culture, the funeral lasts about 3 days. And it can be a bit of a party. And people go there to kind of pick up as well. Let's be honest, right? People go like try and meet other people, and at these wakes they go on for 3 days. So you'll have like the removal from the house, and then like the church and afterwards, and all these different phases of what goes on. But Kevin talks about basically going to some of these wakes growing up in the 70s and 80s in Ireland, and meeting girls and boys meeting girls, and it was a whole social environment about it, and going in and having tea and sandwiches and alcoholic drinks and that whole exposure to death over time. Because I find here in Australia, I never see like a funeral go down the road, but 2-3 times a week in Ireland, walking on the street, I'd see a funeral. People would stop, bless themselves, whatever it is, walk a few steps behind the coffin, and then walk away. And that was kind of like, but over here for the first year or so, I've been here for 20 years, but the first year or so, I was like, said to my wife, who's from Melbourne, does nobody die here? I never see a coffin. I never see a hearse or a funeral parade. She goes, oh, it's not like Ireland where people would slow march down to town. I don't know if that still happens in Ireland and Cairn, in Ireland.
Those, of course,
yeah. People actually slow walk down through the middle of town, holding up traffic, and nobody gets pissed off or irate about it. People go, it's a funeral, just like fucking relax, type of thing, And sometimes when the funeral come by, people would close the doors of the premises and stand outside. So they'd have these kind of rituals around it. But we're so exposed to lots of funerals and death that I don't know if it helps culturally or not, but it's just interesting the difference in Irish culture towards death here. But then again, I think, Karen, we do anything for a piss up anyway and to get a drink, so maybe that's why.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, and I agree that in Australia we don't have, with the exception of COVID, we don't really have those reminders of death right then and there. That in Sydney, where I live, we have the largest necropolis in the Southern Hemisphere, which is Rookwood Cemetery, which is probably 45 minutes drive away. And the cemetery is so large, it has its own postcode. And to visit that cemetery, it's really like a day's trip. You can't just sort of swing past it on your way to work or anything. The cemeteries, Australia is a good example because it's obviously a more recent country, that the cemeteries are buried very far away from the main cities. If you want to visit the dead, you have to go on a bit of a trip. Whereas for much of human history, our dead were buried near us, in the local church graveyard, for instance. You would walk past the graves of ancestors, family members. You would also care for the dead. You would care for the dying. You would bathe the body of the dead in your home. And now all of that is outsourced to, funeral homes, the funeral industry, and so on. And funerals, again, are a good example of how our culture doesn't really equip us very well for death, that we don't have things like a 3-day funeral, at least for a lot of people in Australia. You don't have that same kind of community and ritual around death, where in some other parts of the world, they're much better equipped with those things. It's much more normal to talk about death, to openly grieve, to have kind of frequent reminders of the dead person in your house. But in a lot of Western cultures, we don't have those same tools to help us with grieving.
A buddy of mine was at a funeral last week or 2 weeks ago of an aunt, I believe, of his, and it was. I've never been at a funeral like this before, because where I was from in Limerick was kind of in the city, and this isn't really a kind of an Irish city kind of funeral, but parts of Ireland still do funerals like this, as evidenced by my buddy 2 weeks ago, who it was a 3-day event where the body was in the house for all 3 days, and there was always someone in the room at all times for 3 days, and people took turns. And the house, like, neighbors came from all over the area to help get the house ready, and people would be up drinking whiskey all night and hanging out and chatting, and the next morning neighbors would come through and clean the place for the people who owned the house, so that they didn't have to do it. And then they took turns making sandwiches. It became this big community event. And they'll even do things like in the rural parts, like he mentioned another funeral that he was at, where a neighbor who didn't even get on with the guy whose wife died, or daughter or son died maybe, came through, and he lived up a country lane, so the traffic wouldn't have been able to work. Some of these funerals are huge. And he took a ditch down for him and built a road for him through another fella's land, so that cars could actually get through and that the funeral could actually go ahead. That there's parts of Ireland where there's still a really, it's a really communal event and really community based, and a really rich part of the community still to this day. But it's not in the cities like Cork or Limerick, where I grew up, or Cork where I now live, but it's out in like Clonakilty, which is another 45 minutes out towards West Cork. There's still parts of this going on, and it was really interesting to say this.
But even Kieran, growing up, if I went to a wedding, you'd see less people at the wedding service. Obviously, to go to the after part, to go to the dinner and the after. But you wouldn't see that many people at a church at a wedding in Ireland. But for a funeral, it'd be packed.
Thousands of people.
Absolutely packed.
Out
and
the
all
door,
sorts of people out the door. I know some people would, like, in their 40s and 50s, be at a funeral every week, because they just go, and they'd be at some part of the funeral. I would say probably in my life growing up, I was at 30 to 40 at some stage of them. Eddie Lenihan, who's a storyteller who tells a lot of like fairy tales and folklore stories in Ireland. He'd be probably in his late 60s now, 70s. Great guy. If you look him up, I'll put some links in the show notes. Eddie Lenihan talks a lot about Irish culture, and exactly to that point, Karen, about people doing that and how it's dying in Ireland as well. We're losing that cultural aspect, and we obviously had Johnny Dillon on from the National Folklore Collection recently too. And it's really interesting how, these things are part of the Irish culture, which then gets me back to what we spoke about at the start, Rachel, is about cultural worldviews. And, I think, like, even for myself, I still identify about being Irish. I'm very proud of being Irish. I still identify as an Irish person. There's a somewhat of a framework or attributes that you should display as an Irish person. And so I still have them. I'm very strong and proud of them today. And I'm like, this is interesting. Like, I still, after all this time, still do them. And it's bizarre how these things, this is a conversation we could have for days here, I think, like about how all these things link in. It's quite fascinating. Yeah.
Could I ask a question in relation to CBT and death anxiety? And it's something that Ian mentioned earlier on with Johns Hopkins. And it's something that I have a massive interest in, but I haven't been able to find anything on it just yet. And maybe research has come out since we chat to the ladies from the Ernest Becker Foundation, because I asked them about it as well. But it was basically around, because both of them had come from a terror management theory background. I think both of them had maybe studied with Sheldon Solomon or Jeff Greenberg, who were the TMT founders, two of them. And it's actually got to do with psychedelics and death anxiety. And what brings me to it is we had Chris Leatherby on from UWA maybe before Christmas, who wrote this excellent book called The Philosophy of Psychedelics, where he's basically looking at psychedelic psychotherapy and looking at the research and basically looking at, well, what's actually taking place here such that the benefits are actually occurring, and how much of that is based on non-naturalistic beliefs. There's the book. It's excellent work of philosophy. But he's basically looking at like a naturalistic philosophy of psychedelic psychotherapy. So basically it's almost he's kind of helping to extract what's actually working in psychedelic psychotherapy and basically pull it away from the kind of more esoteric, non-naturalistic narratives that can sometimes get wrapped up in it around interdimensional machine elves, etc., that people might have conversations with when they're in a psilocybin trip. But it's not those components that are leading to these decreases in death anxiety for people who are terminally ill cancer patients, for example, which is where the research began in Johns Hopkins. Is that when they reignited it was in terminally ill patients who had terminal cancer, and this was helping them to cope with their end of life anxieties. And something that occurred to me is a really interesting crossover, because these have been two areas that I've gone down the literature in and reading about books on in the last couple of years. Both of these areas have just struck me as so unbelievably important to our cultural moment in the kind of increasingly secular West and the whole kind of post-Nietzsche God is dead world, where there's a kind of a disenchantment of nature and where there's a meaning crisis, where more people are committing suicide than dying by violence. And there's this people's religious kind of God-shaped hole is being expressed through political tribalism and fragmentation and ethno-nationalism and all sorts of ideological narratives, are people trying to express this meaning crisis through, which I can't help but think is related to death anxiety as part of like what all that we've discussed. I think there's a really important overlaps in here. And basically that something that occurred to me as really interesting research area would be when I think about some of the TMT studies on, for example, some of the stuff on subliminal messaging and flashing words like death versus flashing other quote unquote bad words like pain or suffering or other words. I can't remember exactly what it was. And or using any of the TMT study frameworks, but then being able to take people that are after having partaken in structured psychedelic psychotherapy and basically have a crossover between the two, because there could be some really interesting outcomes there in terms of the impact of mortality salience being watered down or maybe even disintegrated by psychedelic experiences, particularly when you see how strong some of this research evidence is on terminally ill cancer patients and how many of them essentially with a few preparatory sessions, a single 5, 6, 7 hour psilocybin session, and then a few integration sessions, and all of a sudden their death anxiety and their fear of death just evaporates, and they have this sense of even changing their sense of identification, where they start using language that allows them to identify their sense of self with nature rather than as a particular isolated ego that's separate from the world. That there's even a change of identity, what they see themselves as part of nature that's going to return to nature in a way that there's a recognition of kind of interconnection in a very short period of time, just off the back of a few preparatory sessions, a single actual psilocybin session, and then a few integration sessions, and then then you see loads of other things as well on addiction, etc., which we know TMT. There's a lot of TMT research around like on addiction and part of immortality projects. So anyway, I was wondering, that's a load of context, but I was wondering as a question, first of all, if you were aware of any crossover research between psychedelics and terror management theory, because I haven't come across any. And secondly, if you had any familiarity with any of the psychedelic research in relation to death anxiety, is there anything that you could see as an interesting cross?
Yeah, so I think the area of psychedelic assisted therapy has a lot of promise. I wrote a paper in 2020, I think, that was about looking at death anxiety and psychedelic assisted therapy. It was a theoretical paper looking at how possibly the reason psychedelics are so effective with people at the end of life in particular are because of reduced death anxiety, that it might be that this reduction in death anxiety brought about by experiences like ego dissolution, where people feel connected with the universe, a disintegration in their sense of self and so on, that could be the mechanism by which we see. So that was a theoretical paper I wrote a few years ago, and currently I have 1 or 2 papers in the works. One of them's under review at the moment, looking at people who have use psychedelics just recreationally and looking at their self-reported changes in death anxiety. Now that's purely retrospective. So it's us asking them before the experience and after the experience. So there's obviously limitations with that. But it is an area that I think has a lot of promise. I think I would love to do more research in this area, but ethics, I mean, I could talk for another 2 hours about ethics in and of itself in terms of research ethics, but the difficulty that institutions put up just to doing research on mortality salience studies, even, it could take us a year to get a mortality salience study approved by a university. And then adding on to that, psychedelics, I would love to do that research if I had the time to battle ethics committees about it. Because I think it's such an interesting area of research, and I don't know of any studies that have used a mortality salience design with psychedelic assisted therapy. I mean, the research on psychedelics is still comparatively preliminary compared to a lot of other, areas in terms of therapy. So I think it would be an interesting area. Practically, though, I think it's difficult to get to run some of those studies, unfortunately, and largely I think that's often because of people's fears of death, at least in my experience, that even the idea of talking to participants about death is something that university ethics committees balk at, because they think this must be a subject that is inherently terrifying and distressing, and how could we possibly talk to people about death? Even when you want to study this with people who are dying, that the university committees often will still say, well, we can't possibly talk to cancer patients about death because they're dying, as though the patients don't know themselves that they're dying. So that's me going off on a bit of a soapbox, but a short answer is I think it's a really interesting area, and I hope people do more research in it down the track.
Rachel,
as a part, I suppose it's bureaucrats projecting their own fears and insecurities onto a situation. And but it strikes me as a kind of a parting note on it. And it's in relation to a lot of things we talked about here around this this kind of like swing in a certain direction in this focus on kind of like mechanistic medicine and mechanistic view of the human condition, and this kind of extractionist, reductionist, separated view of nature and our place in nature, and all this kind of this swing that our whole culture is going, not just medicine, but our whole culture, that terror management, the work, realizations from terror management theory, but also from psychedelic research, they just strike me as unbelievably important at helping us to navigate basically the biggest crises that face not just us as individuals in terms of our existential crisis of meaning, where this, as I mentioned earlier, more people are dying by suicide than war and natural disasters combined across the world, and in particular in the Western world. And it's like, when you have that, but you also have the collective catastrophic crises of existential risk, where a runaway global warming or nuclear winter or nuclear war and engineered pandemics. And we're in the middle of a pandemic, and as a society across the developed world, where you'd expect with so much wealth and so much science that we would have actually managed to do a good job of managing a pandemic. But with the exception of 2 or 3 countries in the whole world, we made an absolute shambles of it. and made a mess of either completely overreacting and having loads of iatrogenic effects, or completely underreacting initially and making a mess of it. And it was just a disaster compared to other viruses. And so because another major interest of mine is existential risk, and the realizations to where existential risk, just to quickly define it, would be the permanent, an existential threat is something that threatens the permanent loss of humanity's long-term future potential. So it's like what we could accomplish as a species in terms of how good life could be, how well we could, the quality that's possible, and the duration maybe that's even possible alongside that. But that the obstacles, particularly in the increasingly secular West, are going to be around meaning and a sense of connection and interconnection. And the things that divide those up are the tribal views that we can develop potentially as a result of, we discussed around mortality salience and our immortality projects, that differentiates us from other people. So then makes it harder for us to see the long-term future of humanity as even something we should care about, if it's not the long-term future of our own progeny or our own culture, which that in itself is an obstacle. And then on top of that, there's the sense of disconnection from each other, disconnection from ourselves, disconnection from our own trauma, disconnection from the natural world that we are part of, but we see ourselves as separate from and masters over. Like both the term management theory and some of the research on psychedelics seem genuinely some of the most important areas. And obviously these are my biases, but they seem like unbelievably important areas in helping to address the root psychological causes for so many of the actual threats that threaten us, whether it be war, ecological collapse, biosphere destruction, all of these things come from our behaviors that are either tribal or destructive or conflict-based, that are all coming down to a sense of disconnection and a sense of tribal identity at the expense of another tribe. So it's like, there's as terms of areas of research, they just seem so important, but so at the same time, like you have alluded to there, still so taboo to the point where it seems like two of the most important research areas, they still seem to be things that people are unwilling to talk about en masse unless they're really familiar with it. And that just strikes me in itself as a fascinating paradox from an intellectual level, but unbelievably kind of worrying and disconcerting on an emotional level. So that is the case.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk towards the end of Mortals about how this unconscious fear of death is essentially overpopulate the planet because of our desire to extend ourselves through children, to pollute the planet, to destroy the planet because of our denial of death, our belief that we're significant, we're special, that humans can't possibly die, we can't possibly destroy our species because we have this sense of ourselves as gods, as immortal gods. Things like, over-consumerism destroying the planet, and again, that ties back to this unconscious fear of death and our desire to buy more, live large, outshine the people around us. That these behaviors, these unconscious fears are ultimately, if we can't curb them in some way, are going to lead us to destruction. And this again is why we felt that this book was such a kind of urgent thing to get out there, for people to really start drawing these connections between this fear of death and what seems on the surface like it would be completely not connected, like the destruction of the planet.
But they couldn't be more like the catastrophic crises that face us are embedded in the individual psychological crisis, and the fact that that's not acknowledged, whereas this constant blame on systems and structures, and there is a certain amount to put on that, but at the end of the day, it's individuals that are making decisions about what to do with their money. It's individuals that are making decisions about what to do with their political votes. It's individuals making decisions about where to allot their attention in terms of the kind of media they consume or the kind of books that they read or where they put their attention. So it all comes down to the individual's interpretation of reality at each level. And it's like the collective emergence, because it's still going to be individuals that drive institutional change. It's going to be individuals that drive systems change on a larger level. It has to come from people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are clear systemic issues that are causing these problems, but those systems are made up of individuals. Those systems are made up of individuals' greed, individuals' own motives. So yeah, I think there's sort of truth in both of those perspectives.
Yeah.
All right, it's getting late for where Rachel is. The difficulties of managing time zones. So Rachel, first of all, thank you very much for coming on this evening and having a chat with us. Really appreciate it. I think, like we said, we could talk for 24 hours probably straight here, the three of us on this. The book is called Mortals: How the Fear of Death Shaped Human Society. We'll put the links in the show notes. Guys, this is a brilliant book. I actually think, like, I've read Denial of Death. I've read a lot of stuff on terror management theory. This was, I would say, my favorite book. I wish I started with this, because I only came out like a few months ago, but I wish I had this to start with. And this would have been like the overarching view of everything. And then I could have went down the rabbit holes on different things. Because some people go, oh, Becker, it's a bit hard to read. And, you know, like I've started reading Escape from Evil lately, and I found that a bit difficult, but I'm just not in the headspace for it. So this will be, if you're interested in the subject, this is a great book. This is the book that Karen and I should have written, should write in 10 years. But Rachel has beaten us to it. So we were 10 years behind. But so, yeah, get this book and be in the show notes. And we'll put in links as well to anything we discussed and to Rachel's academic work. Rachel, if people want to contact you or follow your work, what's the best way to follow you?
They could go to my website, which is www.rachelmenzies.com. I'm also probably too active on Twitter, so they could also follow me there if they wanted to.
Excellent. All right, Rachel, thank you very much for your time. We'll let you go and get some much needed sleep. And yeah, thank you very much. And we look forward to talking again.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks very much, Rachel.
Thanks very much. We appreciate it, Rachel.
No worries.